Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the agricultural industry, aggregate perspectives, and elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Last week on this program, we talked at length about the challenges of member alignment within co-ops, and especially the root causes of misalignment, the impacts that can have on co-op performance and focus, and what management may want to consider to bring more clarity and consistency to the way member segmentation drives and enables strategy and strategy execution. No doubt about it, it's a big, gnarly challenge. The bad news is it's not alone. It also has a sibling. Divergent interests, as we talked about at length, like I said, among your customers and your members is not the only face of misalignment and friction within a conventional multi-line ag cooperative. Consider this generalized version of a commonly held operating thesis. And I've heard many different versions of this in my discussions over the years. We are one team. We're a diversified co-op, and we work every day to meet the needs of our member customers. I'm confident that this sounds familiar to many of you. It might sound really familiar to some of you. I'm not calling anybody out, but this is a version that I've heard many times. You may already see one weakness in the statement around meeting the needs of our member customers. Again, the entirety of last week's discussion in episode 153 was dedicated to why you may not be meeting member needs across the board, or why trying to meet the needs of all your varied members is actually hurting your performance. The blanket statement of we meet the needs of our customers is actually problematic at its core. But beyond that, there's also this issue of internal alignment. You may call it one co-op. It may feel like one co-op. You may have a culture that binds the co-op together. But for your members, they experience four or more or less, depending on your lines of service, they experience multiple different businesses when they interact with the co-op. So what is the reality of your one co-op, if we're being honest? Think about this in terms of the business lines. In the grain business, it's a capital heavy, it's a volatile, and it's a scale-driven operation, working to always balance the need to invest and modernize with the need to control costs to reflect the brutally narrow operating margins within the business, right? So that's one part of your quote-unquote one co-op. The feed division, conversely, is going to be very service-intensive. It's relationship-driven. It's largely commoditized in most of the cases that I've observed. And it's many times also just protected only by geographic positioning and the freight costs that create a moat for competition a certain number of miles away to come after your customer base. Now, in the agronomy side, that's where the margin opportunity lives, but also the complexity. And so what has historically been a revenue and growth engine for the co-op is actually under considerable pressure. And then propane, or the energy services, maybe you sell propane, maybe you do some liquid fuel distribution, you might sell DEF. This is both for farm and non-farm customers. It's a business of a lot of regulatory exposure, and it often has a lot of counter-seasonal cash flow associated with it. So to restate the tension that I'm trying to point out here is that members don't experience, quote unquote, the co-op. They experience their line of business. And if they interact with multiple lines of business, they might experience different co-ops depending on who they're transacting with on a given day. So similar to last week's episode, let's wrestle with a few questions to kind of give you guys some opportunity to reflect on how this might show up in your organization. So ask yourself this: if you optimize your co-op, or if you're running a diversified agribusiness that's not cooperatively owned, it's privately held, but you've got multiple lines of service, same question. If you optimized for grain execution, what would break in a feed, agronomy, and energy business? If you optimized for agronomy, what would break elsewhere? And so on. We want you to think about what would be implied if you selected which was the most strategic line of business within your organization. And be honest with yourself. Today, look at the business today. Are you really optimizing for one line of business? It's okay to say no. Ask yourself, do you have the level of strategic clarity at the top of the house to say, yes, we are a multi-line co-op, but ultimately we're an agronomy and more specifically a precision agricultural organization. That's where we're investing in talent, in technology, in assets, in marketing, in positioning and differentiation. Or has it been spread like peanut butter across the multiple different legacy lines of the business? It's not about saying someone's right or wrong. It's not about beating up on people. It's about trying to step back and see things as they really are. It's really hard to read the label when you're sitting in the jar. And I'm hoping that these questions can kind of cause you to step back and look at your situation. If you actually do believe that you're optimized for one line of business, that you do have that kind of strategic clarity, is that reflected in the decisions that you're making? And is it reflected in the the results that you're delivering? Some really important questions to think about. Co-ops face so many exogenous or external pressures, competitive pressures, of course, regulatory, environmental, and a bunch of other angles. It's tempting to put aside these sort of internal facing questions, member segmentation, business alignment, other things we've talked about here on the program over the last couple of years. It's tempting to put them aside and just focus on the technicals of running the business, especially in a rough period for the industry as we're in right now. But what we're talking about here is something that you can really influence. So while it might not seem as pressing as, lower commodity values or securing fertilizer supply for the next application season or whatever it is, you actually can put your fingerprints on this. You don't hold sway over the availability and cost of labor in your trade area. You can't meaningfully influence the regulatory treatment of crop protection products that you're hoping to retail to your members. You can advocate a position, but you don't ultimately decide what the financial incentives are for renewable or biofuel processing. You're not at the table for determining the future of global trade conditions, for the cost of energy, for these kinds of things, but you do have control and, in fact, accountability for the way you go to market, the way you serve your customers, the way you stand up an operating model that reflects what you're optimizing for. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to talk about where alignment can break down in multi-line ag co-ops, talk about how this business line alignment intersects with the member segmentation work that we discussed last week. I want to talk about the role of capital allocation in business alignment and bringing those lines and those memberships together. And we also want to talk for a moment about what strong business alignment looks like, right? This isn't an elusive sort of vision for the future that no one's achieved. It exists. What we want to do is try to replicate that success in more organizations to deliver more profitable, relevant, and sustainable co-ops to serve the American producer. Very briefly, as we do every week, I want to invite you to support the show and the work we do every week by subscribing to the podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And at the end of today's episode, it would mean a lot to me. I'd really love it if you consider leaving us a review on your podcast player of choice. It really helps boost the show and get these episodes out and in front of more people in our industry and help us improve our impact. Thank you as always. So first and foremost, where does alignment break down by business line in a multi-line co-op? I think it breaks down from the point of inception in that each of the businesses actually confront very different needs and objectives. So let's start with, we're going to go with the four conventional lines of business of grain, feed, agronomy, and propane, generally energy, but we're going to talk about propane today. Within the grain business, they're serving multiple different types of farmers, large producers and small producers, to be overly blunt here and simplistic. Large producers want fast turns at the elevator. They want good basis performance and offers. And they want minimal friction in the way they operate with you, right? It's already a brutal enough business. They don't need to be fighting with load applications and splits and scale ticket issues and slow truck lines. They just want minimal friction. They want to get in and out and get back to work. Small producers typically want access to different markets, access to different risk management products that you might offer. They need some patience. They want patience with their partner, patience with them. They want to learn and they want to scale their business. And they're looking for a relationship, right? Those lower producers really value the relationship they have with the local elevator. One of the hidden fractures within the co-op that shows up time and again is that the grain division is actually a place that a lot of the capital flows through the course of a year. And a lot of talent will flow there too, because it's these elevators, despite the promises of technology, most co-ops aren't running manless, autonomous elevators. They're running complicated, manually driven, tough, people required environments that take a lot of hands on deck. So capital and talent flows towards grain, but of course, only a subset of members are fully benefiting from that. And that's one of the fractures that'll show up. Now let's talk about feed. Feed, conversely, is going to be kind of a high touch, low margin, and labor intensive business as well. In many cases, not all. So this doesn't apply to your co-op, bear with me. But in many cases, it's subsidized, certainly by the agronomy division and perhaps even by the grain division, depending on the location you're in and the business cycle that you're working through. And the feed division is also critical for smaller and livestock focused members. Might not apply to some of the larger producers that are both consumers of or customers of your grain division, your agronomy division, your propane division. So it has a slightly different profile. Now, one of the fractures I see here, again, I'm being very general, but one of the ones that can commonly show up is that feed over time can become somewhat of a more of a legacy obligation of the co-op and less of a strategic choice. We could talk at length about some of the different avenues that co-ops have taken to remedy this situation, to either run a larger, more forward-oriented feed division, packaging it into joint ventures with other area competitors, exiting it entirely. There's a lot of different options. But the fracture that I do see from a business alignment perspective is that the feed division can become somewhat of a legacy obligation. And it's one of the things that if we ask after the meeting's over, if you discuss in the hallway, if you didn't have a feed operation today, would you build it? There's a very uncomfortable moment of teeth sucking, and then a knowing glance to say, I think you already know the answer to that. And I wish you wouldn't ask me that. Now, agronomy, of course, as I said earlier, that's often the margin engine of the co-op when it's executed well. Agronomy drives tech adoption in the business. A lot of the ESG programs go through agronomy, both the incentives and some of the strategic partnerships that can be born of that. Variable rate services, a lot of things that are driven through agronomy. And there's high demand for agronomic services, whether it is soil mapping technology, whether it's the sales agronomist, making the recommendations, providing the chemicals, even the precision ag services. There's high demand from progressive and increasingly large operations. The alignment tension, the fracture that shows up is, are we an agronomy partner? Are we an input supplier? If we want to be an agronomy partner, are we a partner to every segment? Right? There's some natural efficiencies in supporting larger operations with larger fields and acreage than smaller ones. So there's a fracture among agronomy with other divisions, but also within the agronomy business itself that speaks to the challenge of business alignment. And then finally, the propane division, right? This is a mix of farm customers, residential customers, maybe some commercial customers. I think it's often misunderstood by a lot of ag-focused boards, what the actual drivers of that business are, how to achieve some scale, how to differentiate, how to grow that business. But it does provide cash flow stability until unseasonably warm weather hits or regulations or some kind of incident would dampen that. But the thing to keep in mind here that is often the propane customers often aren't emotionally attached to the co-op in the way that they might be with the grain agronomy or feed divisions. So they're not emotionally attached, but they do fund it in exchange for their business. So the big question here, again, these were very simplistic summaries of the different lines of a typical multi-line co-op. But the big question here is which business lines for you are strategic? And which ones are you carrying out of just simple habit? And again, I want to say this, saying, this is actually a business that is born of habit, not strategy, does not mean that you stop running it tomorrow. It does not mean you're not going to invest in it. It does not mean that it's not have some role in the growth of your organization and providing a valuable service to your member community. But you do need to have a clear reckoning around what is a strategic line of business. Just like last week, we said, you need to really have a clear reckoning around who are the strategic customer segments that we want to grow with. A lot of benefit is born from those tough deliberations and discernments. Now let's talk about how does these different ways these businesses show up, intersect with member segmentation. I'm going to do some very quick typical member segments here. Let's say you have large diversified operations in your trade area. A large diversified operation is probably a customer of your grain and agronomy business. Maybe propane too, but certainly grain and agronomy in a meaningful scale. You've got your livestock-focused producers that are, of course, going to be both feed and grain customers, perhaps not originating grain to you, but buying it from you and also buying feed and blends. You have your small to mid-sized legacy farms. They probably transact with all of the lines that you offer, but they also have a high service expectation, right? It takes a bit more to serve these guys because it's a smaller volume and there's many more of them. You have your next gen operators, which we didn't talk a lot about last week. We're not going to talk a lot about this week. We'll do a future episode on that generational transition. But the next gen operators, they're looking for technology and flexibility and optionality, fundamentally different from a lot of legacy growers we have. And then you're going to have your non-farm propane customers too. They want a good price to heat their homes or their equipment, run their equipment, and they want reliability, right? You're going to show up when they're getting low. You're going to replace the tank if it's required. You're going to be a trusted partner, not just to give them a good price, but to give them good, solid, predictable supply.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
The hard truth here is when you kind of look at the intersection of all those customer segmentations and all those different lines of the co-op, you don't have one co-op serving all member interests. It's not possible. Trying to align all of them with one value proposition is simply impossible. It cannot be done. It cannot be done in a way that you can actually defend and would stand up to scrutiny. So what you need to consider doing is segmenting by line and mapping them. So asking things like, let's look at our business segments first. Which segments are driving capital returns and at what level, right? This is not putting a business on trial for its life. This is asking some of the questions. Let's do a clear-eyed assessment of the businesses. Which ones are driving capital returns? Which ones are providing some degree of volume stability over the recent past and the present and the foreseeable, reasonably predictable future? Who has volume stability? Who has, this is going to be familiar from last week, strategic future relevance? Which one are businesses that we not only expect to be in, but we need to be in 10, 15, 20 years from now to become the co-op in the agribusiness that we have set forth in our strategy? Now, that's kind of what it brings to the business, right? What it offers: capital returns, volume, strategic relevance. Now, which segments sort of drive a higher cost to serve? Are there some segments of your business that are simply more complicated and more expensive to actually serve the customer? Which segments drive a high degree of exceptions, right? Where maybe it's the nature of the business, maybe it's the nature of the way that you operate the business, but there's a high degree of exceptions. Everything's kind of messy, everything's kind of sloppy, everything takes a lot more time and debate and discussion than is necessary, and that shows up in its results. And which segments are driving some cultural resistance? If you're moving the organization in a particular direction, and moving that organization in that direction requires some new behaviors, demonstrated, felt behaviors, and it's creating cultural resistance, where does that resistance show up? Oftentimes it will show up in some business segments more than others. And that's an important thing to get clear-eyed about. So if you're sitting with your board, here's the question I'd say you to ask them. In the meantime, ask yourself, if we had to cut one service line tomorrow, or even one service tomorrow, which one would it be, and which member segment would scream, right? So you start to scenario plan this out. What would we cut, and who would get upset about it? And then ask yourself this question: would the co-op survive it? Again, not advocating that a higher cost to serve or lower volume stability or any of the reasons that you might say this is the line we might cut. I'm not advocating that it's on the chopping block or on trial for its life. But if you ask those questions and then you also do the gut check of would we survive that? That kind of explicit segmentation and examination has a real cleansing effect on how you can think about the work you're currently doing within the longer term lens of the co-op that you want to create for tomorrow, and how you will grow and evolve into that direction. It's a very powerful effect. Co-ops experience, from my point of view, too much drag from legacy and inertia. And I could go into some of the reasons for that, but I think it all comes back to the idea of shared prosperity. We are stewards of the community. We exist, but for the success and the survival of the producer. And those are noble, necessary, chartered reasons to be. But the problem is when that legacy and that inertia and that drag encourages us not to revisit our assumptions about the business and not to even ask the question because the possible, even the probable answer is too much to stomach, we're not doing our jobs. You still have the burden and the obligation to ask these questions and look at the business. And the more you ask these questions, the more you'll cut through the noise and actually see some opportunities to bring some of the clarity and alignment that we've been talking about. No business suffers because of more clarity on what the business lines, who they serve, what segments they serve, what the current profitability looks like, what the future-oriented profitability outlook is. Nobody suffers a downside impact from that. No one is hurt by struggling with these questions and thinking about how this is reflected in or rejected when you stress test it against the vision of your organization. So let's talk about one of the places where alignment can become real. So if you start to actually have clarity around the members that you're serving, the strategic segments, and the strategic businesses that are going to drive growth. If we're honest with ourselves, co-ops generally don't completely exit a business, right? So I've talked about, not asking these questions is problematic, not advocating for businesses to be on the chopping block. It's because I know at the end of the day, a typical ABC multi-line co-op is not going to say, you know what? Yeah, the grain business has historically just not performed well. We don't differentiate. We've got old assets. We can't staff them. We got too many assets. The market's not providing an opportunity. There's too many processors here that are cannibalizing our volume. We're just getting out of the grain business. Very, very, very unlikely, right? But there are some that'll look at a line of business and maybe try to roll elements of it into a joint venture. They might look at a type of strategic partnership with another organization, or they might look like narrowing their offering such that they speak to specific counterparties in the market to actually overcome some of the drag. But rather than all that, rather than shutting things down, typically we start to make indirect decisions about the strategic nature of a business in the ways that we allocate capital. And that's why I think capital allocation is one of the best ways to look for the presence of or the absence of business line alignment within a co-op. Capital allocation is where conflict will arise if that alignment's not there. So what are some of the typical conflicts that'll show up? A lot of fighting between we're looking to expand our grain origination and handling capabilities, or we're looking to invest in agronomic technology. If that is a fight that is happening at the management team level, at the department head level, at the employee line level, if that tension exists, to me, one of the first things I would look to is which one of these divisions have we said is strategic to the growth of the organization? Have we been explicit and rigorous and clear with conviction about that decision? Because if we have, that should help us to mute and eventually stamp out the conflict deeper in the organization. We've said that this is a strategic division for us. Picking a strategic division requires trade-offs, and the trade-offs are going to be that a lot more capital is going to flow one direction versus the other. You also see it in terms of, should we be doing feed mill upgrades versus investing in automation elsewhere? You'll see it in, are we going to buy propane tanks, or are we going to actually buy rail cars? Are we going to build storage? Or are we going to build the capability and the trackage for rail shuttle loading? There's all these different ways that when these conflicts show up, and if they're being adjudicated and debated deep in the organization, it's because the alignment didn't exist at the top of the house. Or if the alignment did exist at the top of the house, it wasn't communicated effectively throughout the co-op and the agribusiness such that people could come to expect these trade-offs. And maybe they don't like them, maybe they don't agree with them, but they can understand and predict them derived from the strategy. So the insight here that I really want you guys to think about is capital allocation, when done thoughtfully and looking beyond the relative return of one project versus another, is a driver of member alignment. Or it can be a disruptor to member alignment if you didn't have that prior level of leadership cohesion around where we're going to invest. So here's some reality check questions for you again to ponder. Look at what your last couple of years, maybe your next couple of years capital allocation and deployment plan looks like. And then ask yourself, are you investing for business fundamentals and the outlook on the business? Or are you investing for member preferences? No right or wrong answers. Just be honest and truthful with yourself. Are you investing in explicit growth areas for the organization? Or are you investing to preserve the legacy lines of business that your members have come to expect and appreciate in the way you serve the community? When you're responding to members in terms of how you allocate capital, is that response to members based on segmentation, rigorous analysis of what they're going to need in the future, or speculation on what you think they might want, or the most recent complaint that you've heard? And also, the members who are the loudest. Are you investing for the loudest members, or are you investing for the members that are going to exist in 2040? That's some of the things that we really need to be thinking about in the way that we allocate capital. You can invest in some assets to reinforce your strategy. You can invest in some assets to preserve the peace. I think it'd be better to be investing in a way that reinforces and drives your strategy. But as of today, the moment you're listening to this, what's most important to me is that you can sit down and think about it and just be clear with yourself. Do that sort of diagnosis. Where do our capital allocation dollars flow? Are we preserving peace, or are we creating the future? Your capital allocation will either reflect or run directly into your governance process. As I've said, the better job you do at this, specifically how you come to those decisions, the level of rigor and analysis around segmentation, the analysis around what the future market opportunities are going to be, the vision around where the co-op is going to sit and how it's going to serve the membership community. The more that you do this, the better equipped you're going to be to explain your decisions, to reinforce your strategy through those decisions, and to actually stand up and take the blowback from some of the folks that you will invariably disappoint. We all know you're not going to make everybody happy with your capital plan. So finally today, what does alignment look like in a multi-line co-op? Right? We've pointed to the problem, and as we did last week, we also pointed to here's what good would look like if you had a level of alignment that was actually driving your strategy. Aligned co-ops do these things well. They have a clear strategy by their line of business. Not just a overall organizational strategy, but each individual division will have its own strategy. And they will roll up into one view for the future. And that one view of the future will appropriately weight, WEIGHT, will weight the value of one business versus another. Within those businesses, they will have explicit member value propositions by segment. You might say, look, if you've split your customer base, your membership base into, 5 different profiles, your grain division might serve 2 profiles, your feed division might serve 2 different profiles, and your agronomy might bridge the 2, but none of them share all the same profiles. But you'll have that clarity around who are we here to serve and how we best do that. As you start to get out of these higher cost to serve operations, you start to work on processes, you'll become an organization that's built on standards, not exceptions, which is going to not only improve your performance, it'll improve over time what customers come to expect and how they experience you. It'll improve staff turnover and overall lead to a better, more efficiently run organization. You'll have capital that's tied to future relevance, not nostalgia. And again, you'll have communications that explain the trade-offs repeatedly because you'll have the comfort and confidence of having done the work to get to a point where you can explain, advocate, and defend those decisions. So to kind of close this out today, one of the things when I talk about business alignment that I want to really make sure is clear, business service line alignment doesn't mean that every business or even every member wins every time. It means that the co-op is going to win over time. And again, the objective here is not the co-op should exist solely for the purpose of the co-op existing. The co-op has a reason for being. And if we can make these kinds of tough but necessary and completely appropriate decisions and how we plan, invest, and execute within the co-op complex, co-ops will be profitable over time. They will be a mainstay of the agricultural supply chain, and they will be able to continue to serve rural communities and the producers and ranchers, farmers, and counterparties that live there. This is a heavy topic, I know, and I'm not going to delude myself for a moment that I did it justice. The intention here today is to try to frame it in a way that highlights how you are likely already experiencing some degree of misalignment today, and to try to point to some potential points of origin from which it's growing in your business, and also try to offer some ideas to help you pragmatically start talking about and examining and improving business line alignment within your co-op. Combining this challenge with the challenge of membership alignment we talked about last week is considerable. But the challenges, the risks and opportunities, they're there, yes or yes, right? I'm not creating them by naming them, but hopefully I'm doing you a service by helping you bring them into focus. If you've been head down, justifiably head down and running your business during a time of very challenging conditions and reduced profitability, and for many people, fewer apparent growth opportunities. This is about visibility and awareness. Once we've got that, we can move to understanding, and then we can move on to action and doing something about it. I want to close today with an invitation. If you're a co-op GM, a CEO, or executive team member, and you're interested in talking about how these types of challenges have presented themselves in your career and in your organization that you've worked in, especially if you've cracked the code on how to navigate these issues in a way that's preserved the goodwill of your current members and maybe also created something compelling for future members, or even if you think that I have it all wrong and there's something fundamentally different here at stake, I would love to talk to you. I'd love to hear from you. So reach out. There's links in the show notes. Let's get in touch. Let's have a conversation. And potentially we can even have that conversation in front of a hot mic, have you on the show so we can share your perspective with listeners so that they can benefit from learning what you know, replicating the success that you may have had, maybe avoiding some of the mistakes that you've made as well. So the invitation is there. You can contact me, like I said, with the links in the show notes, and I hope you do. And I want to thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate all of you being part of the Pacesetter Pod community and taking the time to listen, to consider the topics that we discuss and potentially action ways to improve strategy execution in support of growing your agribusiness. You're in a very important segment for the American economy, for the global population, and it's an honor to work with you. Thank you as always for tuning in, and I look forward to having you join us next time right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.